Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, March 21st, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. A report says that the U.S. is considering a plea deal for Julian Assange. So the Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday that the Justice Department is considering whether to offer WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange the opportunity to plead guilty to a reduced charge of mishandling classified information. And this report cited people familiar with the matter. The report said that DOJ officials and Assange's legal team have already had preliminary talks on what a plea deal might look like. However, Barry Pollock, who is a lawyer for Assange, says that he has been given no indication that the department will take a deal. He said in a statement that was released after this story was published by the Wall Street Journal, quote, "It is inappropriate for Mr. Assange's lawyers to comment while his case is before the UK High Court, other than to say we have been given no indication that the Department of Justice intends to resolve the case, and the United States is continuing with as much determination as ever to seek his extradition on all 18 charges, exposing him to 175 years in prison." So Consortium News, Joe Loria over at Consortium News, which isn't an outlet that I trust a lot more than the Wall Street Journal, they reported later in the day that Consortium News had actually previously learned of these talks that happened between the U.S. and Assange's legal team on a potential deal, but the information was given off the record, so they didn't report on it. But in light of this reporting, they said that they actually learned about this as well. So with that, it makes me think that this report is right, although the way that they portray it seems a little sketchy, which I'll get into a little more. But and I'm talking about the Wall Street Journal, not Consortium News. They had a good report on it. Under the DOJ's indictment against Assange, he could face up to 175 years in prison under the Espionage Act for exposing U.S. war crimes by publishing classified documents that were leaked to WikiLeaks by former Army Private Chelsea Manning in 2010. And that was the Iraq and Afghan war logs, the State Department cables. Most infamously, when it comes to the war crimes that were revealed, is the collateral murder video of the U.S. killing the Reuters journalists. That was in Iraq. So if Assange is convicted, of course, it would set a very dangerous precedent for press freedom, since publishing information obtained by a source like he did is a standard journalistic practice, whether classified or not. We see this all the time. The New York Times, The Guardian, all these outlets published a lot of this classified stuff working with WikiLeaks. So there's, that means that they could potentially be prosecuted for this if Assange is convicted. So all sorts of just so much danger to our freedom in the U.S. and around the world, because the U.S. is trying to extradite him from another country, and he's not even an American citizen. He's Australian. So this Wall Street Journal report said that if the DOJ offers a deal for Assange to plead guilty to a lesser charge of mishandling classified information, it would be a misdemeanor, and he could potentially enter the plea remotely without going to the U.S. I know that that's a condition for Assange's legal team. They don't want him to go to the U.S. under any circumstances. His time in London's Belmarsh prison, where he's been held since April 2019, would count toward his sentence, and Assange could be free shortly after reaching the deal. Again, this is what the Wall Street Journal is saying. And while a deal like that could potentially secure Assange's freedom, which of course would be great for him and his family, that could still set a dangerous precedent, since it would criminalize the relationship between a journalist and his source. It might be a lesser charge, but he didn't commit a crime. So, that's the whole thing here. And I put in a quote. I just added this before I started recording. I saw Kevin Gastola. He's a journalist who really focuses on Assange and whistleblower stuff. And he wrote a book on Assange called Guilty of Journalism, the Political Case Against Julian Assange. I wanted to see if he had anything to say about it, so I went over to his Twitter, and he had some interesting stuff to say. He said, basically, U.S. officials chat to the press about some possible plea deal for Assange when he isn't guilty of any crime. If Assange's team signals that it would never be acceptable, then it's Assange's fault that he remains in prison. Officials can say that he wants to martyr himself. And then he goes on to say, it doesn't matter if a plea deal is even on the table or consists of a charge that could legitimately be brought against Assange. The bare fact that Assange won't allow a bad precedent for world press freedom is turned against him by way of making it seem like he's unreasonable. So kind of saying maybe they're leaking this as something that they could use against Assange as part of kind of the propaganda campaign against him. So right now, Assange's legal team, Assange, they're awaiting the decision whether or not they can appeal the UK's Home Secretary's decision to extradite Assange to the US. I think that decision was made all the way back in 2021, and they finally had a hearing last month. And now the decision is whether or not they can appeal. If not, then that means he's probably going to be getting extradited. And I'm sure that when it comes to any kind of potential deal, his legal team, they're not going to want to say anything about it or discuss it really that seriously until this decision is made, I would guess. So anyway, the pressure has been building on President Biden to drop the charges. You've had the Australian government be much more vocal about it recently. Some members of Congress, including Thomas Massey, who brought Assange's brother to Biden's State of the Union. The thing that we can do to add to the pressure, this is what WikiLeaks and Assange supporters are asking Americans to do. You could contact your representative in the House and tell them to support a bill. It's called HRES 934, and it was introduced by Representative Paul Gosar, who's a Republican from Arizona, and it calls for the U.S. to drop the charges against Julian Assange. Let's see how many co-sponsors it has now. Actually, I don't see that. I might be on the wrong page here, but you can call your representative and tell them to support this bill, and just, or just call them and express your concern about Assange. Just try to add to the pressure. Call your senator too, or email them. You could write them, because a lot of times you actually hear back from them more quicker if you email the office. So that's a way that we can kind of build up the pressure, trying to get the U.S. to drop these charges altogether and free Julian Assange. No deal, because he's not guilty of any crime. He should just be free. And that's what we should be telling Congress. All right, so the next one here, getting into Gaza. Physicians describe appalling atrocities in Gaza. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And a group of 4 critical care doctors who were recently in Gaza spoke on a UN panel about the horrors they witnessed in the besieged Strip. The doctors described multiple war crimes, horrendous injuries to children, kids dying of treatable wounds, and a shortage of supplies so severe that young patients die without anesthetic to ease their suffering. So they can't give them any drugs to ease their suffering. It's really, so this was a panel, and you could watch the video that Kyle put into the story here. And these are doctors from the West. The one, I didn't watch the whole video, but the one guy that I saw talking sounded like he was from the UK. And he really, what's his name? Dr. Nick Maynard. He was the one that I saw speak. This one thing that he said was just so horrific. I'll just read what he said. This is, it's just, I don't know. I'll just read the quote. He said, quote, "One child that I'll never forget had burned so bad you could see her facial bones. We knew there was no chance of her surviving that, but there was no morphine to give her. So not only was she going to die, but she would die in agony. And what made it even worse was that there was nowhere for her to go and die. So she was just left on the floor of the emergency department to die. And that's just one story. We've all seen multiple stories like that, end quote. All right, so the next one here, Hamas says that Israel responded negatively to the latest hostage deal proposal. A Hamas official said on Wednesday that Israel responded negatively to the Palestinian group's latest proposal for a hostage deal and ceasefire. So indirect negotiations have been taking place in Qatar, and according to a report from Axios, the deal that's on the table would involve a 6-week ceasefire, although there are major sticking points. So this is Osama Hamdan. He is a Hamas official on the political bureau that's based in Beirut. He said, quote, "On Tuesday evening, our brothers, the mediators, informed us of the occupation's position on the proposal. It is a negative response in general and does not respond to the demands. In fact, it retracts the approvals it previously provided to the mediators," end quote. So he blamed the impasse on Netanyahu, who is under pressure from some hardline members of his government not to reach a deal. And that, of course, is Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the very extreme members of the Israeli government. And I always say that this idea of criticizing Netanyahu, making this kind of a Netanyahu issue and saying that it's only because of him and this crazy government that he's got that this horrific slaughter is happening, when that's not the case. But these two ministers are extremists. About as extreme as you can get. Ben-Gvir has always praised terrorists, Israelis who have carried out terrorist attacks in the past. He said, shoot women and children in the head if they get close to the border wall. Smotrich openly, wants the West Bank and to kick all the Palestinians out. So Netanyahu does have pressure from them. Apparently, they're threatening to quit the government if a hostage deal involves releasing Palestinian prisoners who are serving long sentences in jail. The Axios report said that a U.S. framework for a deal involved Israel releasing 400 Palestinians, including 15 who are serving life sentences, in exchange for the release of 40 hostages. And last Thursday, again, this is according to Axios, Hamas proposed Israel release 950 prisoners, including 150 who are serving life sentences. Hamas is also reportedly asking Israel to withdraw troops from a corridor that the Israeli military created to split Gaza in two so displaced Palestinians could return to the north. Axios described the demand as one of the two widest gaps between the two sides. Israel doesn't want to get out of that area. They don't want to let people return to the north. And then the other big impasse is the fact that Hamas is saying, okay, this is the first phase of a deal. The second phase is a permanent ceasefire. And of course, Netanyahu doesn't want that. He wants to keep this thing going. And he has said repeatedly that if there is any sort of deal, it's going to be temporary and that he still plans to invade Rafah. And then on the Israeli side, Israeli media is reporting that David Barnea, who's the head of Mossad, he came back from the negotiations and basically said and briefed the war cabinet and that they don't think a deal is going to be reached anytime soon. And the death toll now is approaching 32,000 Palestinians. That's what's being put out by Gaza's health ministry. And, no ceasefire means that more Palestinians are going to continue to be killed. The Israeli bombing hasn't stopped. And, of course, the starvation and disease and people dying of that. All right, so the next one here, the Israel lobby is pushing a lie that people are not starving in Gaza. So this article is from the Rolling Stone, which is it's definitely been a while since we've ran a Rolling Stone article, but it says that this week, and this was actually published last week. So last week, Washington's top Israel lobby is rallying its supporters to go to Capitol Hill and falsely claim to lawmakers that people are not starving in Gaza, and Israel isn't blocking aid shipments, according to talking points obtained by the American Prospect. So they get into the numbers here of just the brutality of this Israeli siege on Gaza. So the powerful lobbying group American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, is working to maintain support for Israel's war amid increased protests and public outcry. This week, AIPAC convened in Maryland for its annual policy conference, which it uses to marshal its donors and supporters to serve as a grassroots lobbying army in the halls of Congress. The Prospect obtained a copy of AIPAC's talking points for supporters heading to the Hill, and they are extreme to say the least. The document instructs supporters to claim that reports that people are starving in Gaza are false, and say that Israel is not blocking the delivery of aid, which are lies. We know people are starving, and we know Israel's blocking aid. So the AIPAC talking points additionally claim that Hamas wants people to believe Gazans are starving in order to exert pressure on Israel, and argues that the United States must not fall into Hamas's trap. And then this gets into how, according to the Integrated Food Security Phase classification, all the Palestinians in Gaza are facing crisis levels of food insecurity. And that's something Antony Blinken said. And you have AIPAC going around and trying to get people to lie. Basically, genocide denial in real time, it seems like. All right, so the next one here, Canada pauses arms sales to Israel. So Canada's foreign minister confirmed on Wednesday that the country was freezing arms exports to Israel due to its brutal assault on Gaza. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly said that Canada had not approved any weapons export permits to Israel since January 8th, although any approved before that time are still in effect. So any old deals that they have before that, I guess, are still going through. So her comments came after Canada's House of Commons passed a non-binding resolution to halt weapon sales to Israel in a vote of 204 to 117. The resolution also called for a ceasefire and for Canada to work toward the establishment of a Palestinian state. So Canadian law prohibits the export of weapons if they could be used in a serious violation of international humanitarian law or in serious acts of violence against women and children. And we've certainly seen that. And, of course, Israel was not happy about the move. Israel Katz, the Israeli foreign minister, slammed the decision. He said, quote, "It is unfortunate that the Canadian government is taking a step that undermines Israel's right to self-defense against the Hamas murderers who have committed terrible crimes against humanity and innocent Israeli citizens, including the elderly, women, and children," end quote. The U.S. still continues to provide military aid to Israel despite the massive civilian casualties and the impending famine in Gaza. Under U.S. foreign assistance laws, military aid cannot be given to a country that's blocking the delivery of U.S. humanitarian aid shipments, which Israel is doing. I linked to the story about Israel still blocking that U.S.-funded flour shipment. Senate Democrats have pointed this out to President Biden in a letter, but he continues to back the Israeli slaughter. Anyway, so this, Canada, of course, doesn't provide nearly as many weapons to Israel as the U.S. does, but I still think this is significant. I don't think it'll really affect Israel that much, but when it comes to the pressure building on Biden and the Democrats, now there's an example of Canada. This isn't, I know, like Colombia, Brazil, they said that they're cutting things off for Israel. This is, Canada, the U.S.'s neighbor, a NATO ally, doing this. So I think it certainly could be used to pile on the pressure. All right, so the next one here, Biden, speaking of that type of pressure, Biden donors say that his unconditional support for Israel could cost the election. So a group of over 100 Democratic donors sent a letter to President Biden this week warning him that his unconditional support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza could cost him the election to former President Trump, who, of course, is another staunch Israel supporter. So the letter said that likely Biden voters are, quote, now questioning whether the Democratic Party shares their values. If they stay home or vote for a third-party candidate, there is the very real danger that President Biden will be defeated in November, end quote. So the New York Times obtained this letter, and they said that a handful of the signatories had donated six-figure sums to President Biden's 2020 and 2024 campaigns. So these are relatively big donors, showing that the opposition to this, it's not just among, the average young, progressive-leaning Democratic voter. These are people with some serious money, which means that they have influence in the Democratic Party. So the letter said, quote, "The Biden administration has been providing armaments, including 2,000-pound bombs, which have been used to flatten entire civilian neighborhoods, causing massive civilian casualties with a high ratio of women and children. President Biden has asked Netanyahu to minimize civilian casualties, but has threatened no consequences as Netanyahu has continued to ignore him," end quote. I just mentioned some of the other pressure from within the Democratic Party. So in all of the Democratic primaries that have happened recently, 10% of Democratic voters have, or whoever was voting in the primary, depending on the state, 10% of voters voted uncommitted to express their opposition for his support for Israel. So that's significant, and that includes over 100,000 people in Michigan, which is a swing state, so that could have an impact here. And the Biden campaign events have been disrupted, everybody calling him Genocide Joe, and all that. So hopefully at some point, something gives here. I keep thinking that something will give. All right, so the next one here, the Pentagon is still open to sending troops to Haiti. So this article is from Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, and it says that a senior U.S. military official said the Pentagon has not yet ruled out an American deployment to Haiti, which has seen a spike in violent unrest that prompted the resignation of the country's prime minister last week. Speaking during an event hosted by the Atlantic Council on Tuesday, U.S. Southern Command head General Laura Richardson was asked whether she envisions boots on the ground in the Caribbean nation. She said, quote, "Not right now. They could be at the end of the day. We wouldn't discount that at any time," end quote. So not ruling out sending troops. And the U.S. has been backing a Kenyan, they've been backing this idea of Kenya sending an intervention force, and the U.S. will fund it. But they've been kind of trying to get someone else to actually do the military intervention. And this, of course, is to basically they would do that to install who they want in power in Haiti. I don't know too much about the players in Haiti, but I know Ariel Henry, who is the prime minister who resigned, he took power in 2021 after the previous prime minister was killed, Jovenel Moïse, and he was backed by the U.S. Henry was. So he took power with no election and he was viewed as not a legitimate ruler, and now there's this big uprising, and it's the media calls everybody gangs, which is kind of strange when it's clear that the barbecue man Jimmy Cherizet is leading an uprising and is leading like a paramilitary organization, and there is other types of gang, maybe crime related violence happening, of course, but this is something we got to be careful of with all this propaganda that's going around. So I think they're definitely thinking about it. I think with everything else going on, this isn't something that they would do imminently, the U.S. actually sending troops, but they're trying to figure out how to make sure I know there's a group of people that want to take over that the U.S. favors, and they're trying to form some council to pick the next leader, and the U.S. is backing that, but the situation on the ground just isn't allowing for that right now. All right, the next one here. Israel strikes observation posts and buildings in Lebanon. So Israel continued its airstrikes against southern Israel on Wednesday, and this is a daily occurrence now, and said that they hit some buildings and observation posts that they said were used by Hezbollah. There hasn't been reports on casualties in each strike, but Lebanon's Ministry of Public Health issued a new statement on the situation, and they said that there were 5 new injuries reported among civilians. It wasn't clear if that was from the strikes on Wednesday or it could have been the ones the day before. But I saw this update that they put out, said that the new injuries brought the total injuries since October 7th, since Israel started bombing southern Lebanon, to 1,225 and 316 deaths. So 316 people have been killed in southern Lebanon. And I'm not sure the breakdown of civilians and Hezbollah fighters. I know that at least a few dozen civilians have been killed, though. So always an area to keep an eye on and worry about potential big escalations here. The next one, French general says that the army is ready for the toughest engagements. So more bellicose rhetoric from the French. The head of France's ground forces said in an op-ed that was published on Tuesday that the French army is preparing for the toughest engagements amid talk from President Emmanuel Macron about sending troops to Ukraine. So General Pierre Schill, who's the chief of the French army staff, said, quote, to guard against aggression and defend its interests, the French army is preparing for the toughest engagements, end quote. He also said that France, he got into like the numbers of troops that they could deploy and get ready to fight. And he said that France would be able to commit 20,000 soldiers to an allied coalition within 30 days, and added that the country could command a corps of up to 60,000 men in coalition by combining a French division with one or more allied divisions. So kind of oddly specific, like the type of what he's talking about here. And he didn't mention Ukraine explicitly, but it sounds like he's saying we could get 20,000 troops ready to go to Ukraine, pretty quickly. I don't know what else he would be talking about. And he closed the op-ed by warning that the French military was ready for any situation. He said, quote, whatever the evolution of the international situation, the French can rest assured their soldiers will be there, end quote. And I just go over the stuff that Macron has been saying, about troops going into Ukraine. And this week, the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service said that he had information that France was considering sending 2,000 troops to Ukraine. So that's Russia saying that in like a number like, what would be the point of sending 2,000 troops if not just as like a tripwire or just as a provocation? And of course, we know that there is a small number of NATO Special Operations Forces in Ukraine, but that's probably just a few dozen. According to the Discord leaks last year in March 2023, there was 97 NATO special operators in Ukraine at that time. All right. It's just really unbelievable, this rhetoric we're seeing from Macron and the French over this. I don't get what they're trying to do. All right, so the last story here, the U.S. to spend $400 million to expand an airfield in Micronesia. So the U.S. is planning to spend $400 million to upgrade an airfield on the island of Yap, which is part of the Federated States of Micronesia. And this was reported by Air and Space Forces magazine. So this is part of the U.S. military's plan to prepare for a war with China. They are working to establish dozens of new airstrips and other types of footholds on small islands across the Asia Pacific. This concept is known by the Air Force as the Agile Combat Employment. In some cases, the U.S. is actually clearing away jungle that has overgrown World War II era runways, and one of those airfields that they're restoring in the northern Marina Islands was where the U.S. Planes that nuked Japan took off from. I know the Enola Gay took off from that airfield to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. And that airfield also served as, I think, the launching point for many of the horrific conventional bombings of Japan and the firebombing of Tokyo and things like that. So the U.S. Air Force laid out its plan to expand an airfield on Yap in its budget request for the 2025 fiscal year. I just put in a Google Map screenshot with a red marker showing where this island is. It's about 1,500 miles southeast of China. And if the project is approved, construction will begin in 2025. So this is just, again, I wanted to highlight this because this is an example of the expansion going on in the region. And this is explicitly to prepare for a war with China. U.S. military leaders have said this is the idea of what they're doing is to create more targets for China to have to hit in a war. That's what General Kenneth Wilsbach, who's the head of Pacific Air Forces, he said that last year. So when I say that they're preparing for war with China, that's exactly what they're saying they're doing as well, which is very, very provocative. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Snyder. Why is the West suddenly revealing its troop presence in Ukraine? It's a very good question. One from Chris Hedges. Israel's Trojan horse. And he gets into the pier that Biden is going to be building, or I guess is in the process of building off of Gaza. A lot of people are speculating that could actually be used to deport Palestinians. And, that's not unfounded speculation. There's a lot of good reasons to think that, which he goes into in his article. One from Bradley Devlin. Biden continues to imperil U.S. troops in the Middle East. One from Jonathan Cook. How Western media helped build the case for genocide in Gaza. And the spotlight is from Nick Turse at The Intercept. U.S.-trained Niger junta kicks out U.S. troops. So please go check all of that out. You can always support this show just by sharing it. Like, subscribe. Follow us on Instagram. It's looking really great over there. Follow us on Twitter. But I'll be back tomorrow. One more show this week. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.